Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another social emotional workshop. We will be finishing up our discussion on alcohol usage disorder. I get that correct, Christina? And we're going to be going into opioid and prescription drugs. So, Christina, welcome back. We are so happy to have you.
Yeah, so glad to be here. Awesome, awesome. So we have just a few slides to finish up on the underage drinking. And I believe this is where we left off. So I know we spoke at pretty great length about this from the parent and teacher perspective. And I just wanted to kind of round it back that, as a teen, you can absolutely initiate these conversations with your family members. You can be the one to ask to talk about this. And you're going to have very similar goals of your conversation, right? You want to say that you care, say that you respect them, and still get to the bulk of what you really want to talk about. And of course, our teens, you guys are so aware of the different moods and activities of your parents, and when might be a good time to approach them about that conversation that, maybe the parent's been the one avoiding it, like, I don't really want to talk about that with you right now. And coming at them with that, understanding that your best interest is usually their number one goal. And, maybe they believe that talking about it might encourage the behavior. So knowing that might be their thought, Mom, I know you don't want to talk about this with me. It's kind of crazy, but I want to hear it from you. And I heard at school that talking early and often is actually protective for me. So can we go ahead and have that conversation today? You can reach out and you can be the one that initiates that. So show them that you're confident in your communication skills and you're ready to talk about that really tough topic. But to kind of finish up, we really just have the social host laws left after that. And this does really particularly pertain to alcohol. We come to some of the corrective acts. The law reads very similarly for all sorts of controlled substances, so I'll point that out when that becomes relevant. But the bulk of the law is that it is a misdemeanor to give alcohol to anyone under 21 or to knowingly allow the consumption or possession of alcohol to anyone under the age of 21. So if you know about it, you have to take corrective action. That's what the law says. And some of the best ways that you can kind of prevent that even becoming an issue is being home if your teen is having a party. Letting your neighbor know, hey, we're going to have a party. We'll promise to get that music off by 9 or whatever your local ordinance is. And just kind of bringing everyone to the table in those conversations. And making sure that we know, it's even easier now during COVID. And teens, you can take part in this too. Like, my mom is going to check your backpack and take your temperature when you come to my house. Be aware she's going to do that. And kind of be part of that conversation too and prevent this from happening. But long law slides again, and you can go look this up if you wanted to read the entire Michigan law as it reads. But again, it's just stating that it is a misdemeanor to furnish alcohol to a minor. And what's different about this law compared to some others is that 21 is that line of a minor. And in some of our other laws, it still reads 18. But for anything related to alcohol, marijuana, and now even our tobacco products, the minor line is at 21 and no longer at 18. And it also goes to kind of define that in our state, the relationship to the teen doesn't matter. So if you're another teen, if you're the parent of that teen, if you are a licensed bartender or a clerk at a place that has a liquor license or has the beer and wine type licenses, you are going to be at fault, no matter what the is to the minor if you're the one furnishing it to the minor. And that is different from other states. Some states allow for looser punishments when you're the parent, but our state does not. So that's very important to know. And there's always going to be some financial punishments for these offenses. And quite often they also have some jail time, drug education classes, or community service tied to them, but you're always going to have the fine. Can't get out of that part of it. And then the law kind of goes on to define who exactly is the host. So it gets really tricky, right? So if you own the home where this is happening, you could be considered the host. You're almost always going to be the host in that scenario if you're owning that home. Now, if you are renting the home and you're the one whose name is on that lease, again, you're the one at fault. And that does get tricky even if you're not home. If you're the owner or the lessor, you're going to be the host, even if you weren't at home when that was happening. You're in charge of the premises. And it goes on to kind of define some other tricky spots where, maybe you've rented a pavilion at the park and gotten a license to have beer there. If you're the person who rented the pavilion, you're the host. Even if you weren't present at the time that the minor consumption of alcohol happened, you're the one who signed that contract that you're going to be responsible for the premises. And again, let's say, this isn't happening as much during COVID, but let's say you rented like a large hall for a wedding reception and you've hired a bartender. Because your name is on that rental agreement with the venue, you are really the host, and you can still be found at fault, even if the bartender is the one who was making those transactions. So the bartender can absolutely lose their license to serve, but you can also still be held at fault because you hired them and your name is on the agreement with the venue. So it can be really tricky, and I do encourage you to kind of look up some of those little clauses if you are renting a pavilion, if you are renting a venue, and make sure that you're kind of taking note of whatever's happening. What's the bartender doing? Don't give them just full trust in whatever's happening over there. And then, so if you are noticing that there is a minor who has possession or is actively consuming alcohol, and this is where it's the same for all controlled substances, you have to immediately take corrective action to stop that from happening. What does corrective action mean? You really have to immediately demand that the minor stop doing that and turn it over to you. And, many of us know that you can just enter the room and they might immediately stop. They know they're already in trouble. But other times it takes another try. You've got to say, hey, let's stop. I'll give you a ride home. And if all of these attempts have failed, you do have to notify a person with greater authority. So let's say, you don't own the home. Maybe you can go ask another adult in the home or contact local law enforcement. And in my conversations with local law enforcement, especially with Hope Not Handcuffs being really pushed so hard here in Michigan, their goal really is to help you stop that alcohol consumption and help whatever person might be in danger at that time. So self-reporting and contacting them may very well be in your best interest to get that situation handled in the best, most timely fashion. So again, even if you're another minor, you can be held accountable and be charged with that misdemeanor. And again, even if you're the parent of the individual, you do not have that authority to be able to say, yep, they're allowed to drink. It's still a misdemeanor, even if you're their parent. And you've got to take that corrective action as soon as possible. And actually, failure to do so could be considered a separate misdemeanor. So if you gave it to them, that alone is a charge. And then if you failed to stop it after noticing more occurrences, that could be a separate charge. So it's important to kind of think about that when you're having parties and going back out into the world. But if you'd like to look up any more information, these are all great spots to go. And I really wanted to point out two that are, I think, my favorite. It's SAMHSA and Talk Sooner. And they have some really cool like conversation simulators, and you can do that within you know, either role. So if you're the parent and you're like, I don't know how to initiate this conversation, or if you're the teen and you're like, I don't know how to initiate this conversation, you can go from either route. And it's really cool that you can kind of text back and forth, and all of this can be done very digitally and very anonymously. So these are just really awesome resources to go out to if you're struggling with how to have those deep conversations. But that's the end of alcohol. So before we hop into opioids, is there anything in the chat, Toni? Everybody's signing in. Beautiful. Sweet. So we're going to hop right into opioids if there are questions on that. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce the amazing Joe Galino. And he is going to help me today on some of our neurobiology slides, because opioids are very complex the way they interact with the body. And he is just amazing in his knowledge on that. So he's, you know.
Good afternoon, folks.
All right, so this epidemic really has been going on since the early 90s. And today we're going to look at some data going as far back as 1999, and hopefully you enjoy it. So for our first couple of presentations, we started off with defining that a drug is anything that changes the way we think, act, and feel. And there's, of course, many different categories of drugs underneath of that. So we're going to spend some time talking about illicit and illegal drugs, but there are so many legal drugs that have great medicinal uses. And the two categories we're going to focus on today is the prescription drug and the over-the-counter drug. So over-the-counter is anything that you can buy without a prescription. It might be regulated based on how many you can buy in a month, or how you may have to be 18 to purchase it. But generally, there's a lot less restrictions, and you can just walk into any pharmacy, grocery store, pick up these types of items. The ones that are most regulated right now are pseudoephedrine containing medication. And then, of course, a big uptick on how we regulate cough syrups as well. So you might have to be 18, or there might be limits on how many you can buy in a month. But you don't have to have a prescription. You can go in and get those. Now, prescription drugs, on the other hand, are anything that you have to see the doctor and have him write you a prescription to get. Now, these are not just regulated by you know, the healthcare providers and the pharmacies. They're actually regulated by the federal government. And there are some pretty big systems in place that are just, you know, United States wide, where they can track how many prescriptions that you've got. And it kind of can limit things like doctor shopping and seeking out various prescriptions to get to that point of maybe having a misuse issue. So they can track that at the governmental level. These are the broad terms and classifications we're going to focus on a little bit today. So we're definitely going to be jumping really deep into opioids and opiates. And we're going to also touch on commonly misused prescription drugs that might be depressants and stimulants as well. Now, hallucinogens are kind of a weird one. They really don't have medicinal purposes, and we won't be touching on them today. And then, of course, there are the drugs like marijuana that impact everybody a little bit differently and can kind of straddle the lines between depressant, stimulant, and hallucinogens, where they might have multiple effects on the body, depending on who's taking it. To focus in on prescriptions, we want to just kind of define what it means to abuse a prescription. And it's taking it in any way other than exactly how it was prescribed to you, the exact directions that are on your prescription bottle. So that includes taking someone else's prescription, taking more than is prescribed to you, taking it more often than it's prescribed to you, And of course, taking it in a manner that you're intentionally seeking to get high from it. The most common prescription drugs that are abused are painkillers. And prescription painkillers are the fourth most commonly abused category of drug in the United States. And we kind of did them right in order, right? So tobacco is the most, alcohol is second. Marijuana has been gaining so much traction in the past year or so with legalization, but it's still sitting in third. And then we have the prescription painkillers in fourth. So again, this is just kind of that spectrum of abuse. And a lot of folks, you know, their intentions are benign. Their intentions are to stop pain. But it might cause them to start using their prescription in a way that other than it was originally prescribed for. And then of course, there are folks who do take someone else's prescription legitimately because they don't have insurance, or they're seeking that medication and they can't seem to get it prescribed to them for some reason or another. And their intention may be very well to legitimately solve a medical issue, but it is considered drug abuse to take someone else's prescription, even if you have the same medical condition, you weigh the same amount, you're about the same age. The dosing can still be dramatically different for you. So you can put yourself in great danger taking someone else's prescription. And then of course, the more obvious one of intentionally trying to get high. And we do know that some folks kind of end up in a spiral where they might be doing all three of these at once. They're taking someone else's prescription at a higher dose than it was prescribed with the intention to get intoxicated. But we also see a lot of folks that are somewhere in the middle here, where they're just kind of taking a little bit more than they were prescribed in hopes of nulling that pain. So it really is a pretty broad spectrum. Folks kind of can come in and out of these different segments. Why is this happening? Of course, there is still that, I heard it will make me feel high and I'm really seeking that feeling. But usually it's self-medication. Usually folks are turning towards this type of prescription drug because they're trying to counter pain. It could be acute pain of an injury or chronic pain like fibromyalgia and MS and more long-term issues like that. It could be that they're self-medicating for depression, anxiety, insomnia, and they hear opioids are the way to kind of cure those, and they turn towards it. And of course, with stimulants, we're seeing a huge uptake, particularly with young adults in colleges, where their reason is they're trying to boost their academic performance, and they believe taking a stimulant that can help them stay up longer and might cause more alertness and more focus, such as Adderall or Ritalin. And they're taking it with a pure intention of improving their grades. But it's a very dangerous, slippery slope to go down. And of course, if you're taking that medication and you don't have ADHD, that's something other than the way it was prescribed and intended. So it is indeed drug abuse. What are the most common? Opioids is right there at the top, and that's why we're going to focus a lot on opioids and opiates today. But other commonly abused ones include the barbs and the benzos, stimulants. And then this long monster is that DMX that is in prescription and over-the-counter cough syrups. And that one it's increasingly, it's coming up that list on most commonly abused substances. And probably since about 2015 or so, we've seen big uptakes in that. And it can be prescribed, and in some cases, it's also an over-the-counter cough syrups as well. So I just kind of want to separate opiates from opioids. And I myself even sometimes will slip and use them interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same thing. Opiates are naturally derived. They're directly extracted active ingredients from the poppy plant, from opium plants. And they include things like morphine. That active ingredient can be directly extracted. It doesn't have to be synthesized. Now, opioids are derivatives and synthesized parts. So they come from those direct extracts of opiates. And again, in our society, these are just widely interchanged a lot. But I did just want to make that point so that when you're looking through research, you can kind of distinguish that difference. And this is just some examples of them that are very, very common. And we're going to talk pretty deep about fentanyl and carfentanil later on in the presentation, because that's an emerging issue that we're seeing. Again, these come in so many different forms. And opiates and opioids can really be administered a lot of different ways. The pressed capsules and tablets in liquid, and these can be intravenously administered. In hospital settings, that's through your IV. That's through your IV tubing. But in more illicit ways, that could be something that is injected through a syringe. And then, of course, these powders really don't have, this is not the route of administration that medicinal uses come in. So this is stuff like cocaine and heroin, and these are not typically administered to folks as prescriptions that they would take at home. Those are found more in illicit means and routes of administration. I'd love for Joe to hop on and really tackle this, because it's just so fascinating how many different opiate receptors we have in our brain and spinal cord.
Yes, thank you. And you'll see the slide with all those dots everywhere. I mean, those are all opiate receptor sites. They're not only in our brain, they are also through our whole body. We have them in our groin area. We have them in our midsection here in the stomach. I mean, they're opioid receptors. Now, our body produces opioid endorphins naturally. So when we get hurt, we fall, we break our arms, the pain signals go to the brain, and the brain produces opioids, a neurotransmitter that's going to alleviate that pain naturally. So when we go into trauma, you figure somebody gets hurt really bad, and they're like, how could they take that pain? I mean, they might have a gash that's really exposed, and our body kind of goes into this state where it kind of numbs that pain and shuts off those pain signals to our brain. Now, when we get hurt, well, let me tell you first, in the body, the dopamine in our bodies. Our brains are developed to repeat what feels good to keep us alive. So when we do good things, like when we exercise, we get dopamine in our brain and it feels good. It says, repeat that, that's healthy. When we eat healthy foods, we get dopamine in our brain that says, hey, eat that again. Or when we drink water, we get dopamine rushes in our brain. When we hug and touch people, we get dopamine. So we get a dopamine blast through healthy things in our lives. So now we have these inhibitory neurons that will shut off those dopamine feel-good endorphins, because we can't feel good the whole time. That's like when we use other illicit drugs like marijuana or cocaine, those stimulants that raise that dopamine level really extremely high, and then our regular production goes down because it doesn't know the difference. And then when the substitute wears off, our brains need to catch up. But the more times you use that substitute, the brain gets lazier and lazier to produce that dopamine. So then when the substitute wears off, we feel uncomfortable and we go back to that substitute because our brain gets too lazy to produce it on its own. But when we're talking about opioids, there are inhibitory neurons that keep the dopamine levels at a certain point, and when we do something good, it raises to say do it again, then it comes down. So the inhibitory neurons are keeping that dopamine release in check. Now, when we get hurt, natural opiates go in and relieve that pain, but it's too much pain for just the natural for the natural opioids in our bodies to relieve that. So we need to go to the doctor and get some medication, like an opioid that Christina was talking about. So now that opioid acts just like our regular endorphins in our bodies. It will shut off that inhibitory neuron to release some dopamine to make us feel good. So we have some pain in our bodies. The opioid will shut off the inhibitory neurons to release some dopamine so we feel better. And that is needed for pain management, but only after about 6 weeks, or if we just use it for pain. Because if we continue using that opioid, then it will shut down the inhibitory neurons completely, which will stop the production of dopamine. And that's where the addiction comes from. If you continue using opioids, it shuts off the inhibitory neuron to stop releasing dopamine. And then our bodies won't know the difference when to release dopamine and when not to release dopamine, because that opioid is going to fill that site and it's going to make us feel good. And when we're not on the opioid, then our body goes into some withdrawals. Even when we're not on the opioid, some of the feel-good things that naturally produce dopamine that would make us feel good doesn't work anymore. So we get dependent on that opioid. That's kind of how that reward pathway works in our brains. Once our bodies get used to that substitute, they depend on that substitute and the natural production stops. In the next slide.
Absolutely, we're more at risk for our hierarchy of needs and that reward pathway to be hijacked when we're younger, particularly under the age of 25. So all the way up through the adolescent years, we're very vulnerable to that. Again, you totally covered the markers of dependence and addiction are tolerance. And like Joe said, the more they're used, the less the body creates them itself, and the more dependent we become on the opioid. And that triggers the person in this to seek more. And that's a big marker for dependence. Withdrawal. Did you want to keep going, Joe?
No, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so on the withdrawals, it said that opioids are some of the most painful and obviously distinguishable withdrawal symptoms. So you do see a lot of the same ones, like low energy, increased irritability and agitation, similar to other substances we've talked about already in this series, but some of the ones that are a little different are the runny nose and teary eyes. And this is especially prominent in those that are taking these substances nasal inhalation. And it can become extremely painful in their nasal cavities, and indeed all the way up, because our nasal cavities kind of come up under our eyes as well. So it can impact the eyes. Insane hot and cold sweats, and very dramatic cold flashes that may lead to having goosebumps all day long. You can imagine that would be very painful. Deep sleep changes and disturbances. So insomnia is having trouble falling asleep, but it can also impact the ability to stay asleep and to feel rested and hit REM dream cycles as well. Aches and pains, and these can be legitimate pain returning because you're no longer on the opioid, right? So the body goes, yeah, my leg is still damaged, and that could be a legitimate pain. But we also hear about what they're calling phantom pains, where it's pain in an area other than where the original injury was. There's not like a legitimate injury in that area, but the brain is playing games with our body and can cause kind of overall aches where we can't even distinguish where the pain is coming from. But these folks might be feeling achy all over for most of the day. And like Joe kind of alluded to, we have a ton of those opiate and opioid receptors throughout our digestive tract. So all throughout the gastrointestinal tract, which includes the stomach, the esophagus, the small and large intestines, and of course the colon as well. So these can become just extremely disturbed from using any form of opiate, whether you're taking it intravenously, inhalation, or an oral capsule. The stomach lining and the intestinal linings will be impacted no matter how you consume it. And it can lead to really bad cramping, vomiting and nausea. And constipation is extremely common in chronic opiate users. And it might be interrupted by bouts of diarrhea and then going back to constipation. And it's extremely painful withdrawals, much more painful than some other forms of withdrawals that we've talked about. And then sometimes we're seeing a shift of folks that can no longer get their prescriptions filled. Maybe they've hit their max, they're over 6 weeks, and the doctor's like, we need to start weaning you off. Or maybe they still have prescriptions, but they just can't afford them because even their copay is $100 and they can't get their prescription. Because the illicit forms of these substances have very similar effects, folks might turn to them. And the one that is most commonly turned to is heroin, because it's sadly very widely available and it's pretty cost effective. So even like on the black market, if you will, getting a Vicodin could cost $20 a pill. And if you need 10 of those pills, you're pretty heavy in debt already. But you could get a similar amount of heroin. And unfortunately, folks might turn to that to alleviate chronic pain or because they're in severe withdrawals. And even though it's a less easy route of administration, they might end up going that route because the pain is so severe and their hierarchy of needs has been so damaged that they need that opiate to survive and to alleviate that pain. Just a ton of information about heroin, and I'll kind of come down it, but heroin is just extremely dangerous to our health. Lots of fatal overdoses, and of course, overdoses that don't lead to death are still very terrible. They can cause infertility, miscarriages, and stillbirths in women. Of course, if it's being taken intravenously, there's a ton of risk for developing HIV, developing different forms of hepatitis, and folks that are using intravenously for long periods of time may end up with collapsed veins, where it's very hard for health professionals to even get an IV started for them because they can't find a viable vein to help them. And it can be just very, very sad for those folks when they do finally seek help. A lot of their veins might be collapsed and it's harder to indeed resuscitate them. But any route of administration, so no matter how it's being taken, even if it's a prescription pill, it's going to absolutely still impact our heart and lungs and all throughout that cardiovascular and pulmonary systems, and just huge, huge complications for the gastrointestinal tracts. So everywhere throughout our intestines and our colon can be really damaged by this. And of course, it goes into that cramping and constipation we talked about on the withdrawal. That can be present even before withdrawals happen. It can be present in just chronic users can develop that symptom. And then the liver and kidney diseases, which we talked about pretty heavily during our alcohol session. We know these are filtering our body. So everything we put in there is being filtered out through both of these systems in our kidneys and in our liver. So of course, diseases and cancers can occur in the liver and kidneys. But what we're seeing a lot of is the powdery substances, and they can be white or brown in color. Those are the most common ways that we're seeing it in Michigan. We also see some of the black tar heroin, which is constantly talked about in old cop movies, if you happen to be fans of those. It's been a problem since the early 90s. And these are the forms that it's most commonly being seen in. And although this is a much older statistic, I left it up here because I really liked that it goes all the way down to 12 and it doesn't kind of bin up people the way some of our more recent ones do. So in 2011, 4.2 million Americans, 12 and up, were self-reporting that they had tried heroin at least once in their life. And one time might not seem that scary to a lot of folks, but the big issue is that 23% of folks who try heroin just once become dependent after the first use. And then we also see a lot of fatal overdoses at that first time of use. So it can be very scary, because even though that it sounds like it's just one time and only 1.6% of Americans, a lot of those folks become dependent for life and addicted. And a lot of those folks die from fatal overdoses on just that first use. So that's what makes heroin a really dangerous one to be messing with. And of course, we'll talk about it possibly being, laced with other substances a little bit later. Oh, right, immediately. So what we're seeing a lot of is that, because I don't know how it's readily available on the market, but it seems to be, what a lot of black market manufacturers and drug dealers might be doing is, because it's so potent and they can advertise a higher potency in their product line, if you will, they are intentionally lacing heroin, cocaine, and tons of other powder and tablet forms with fentanyl and carfentanil. And the reason this is so dangerous is that fentanyl can be 50 to 500 times more potent than morphine. And then carfentanil is, again, another 50 times what fentanyl is. And you can kind of see it in the picture. There's like 1 grain of carfentanil in that jar that's equal to, several milligrams of heroin. And that's what makes it it's so potent, and it's so dangerous, because this tiny amount, 1 grain, is enough to cause a fatal overdose. And kind of the good side of this is that, because we've lost some of our most beloved musicians to overdoses of this nature, it does get a little bit more like media coverage, and folks are a little bit more aware of that happening. But again, it's just such a small amount is fatal. And if you don't know that your product has been laced with that, you may absolutely overdose very unintentionally. And in some cases, your dealer might not know that it's been laced either, because he's getting his product from somewhere else, and they're just boasting, it's really potent stuff. It's much stronger. You're going to like it. And they might not even know that it's stronger because it's laced with carfentanil. So it leads to a lot of accidental drug overdoses. And I really love this because it's just so colorful, but we're absolutely going to jump into some newer statistics at the next slide. One thing I really wanted to point out was this guy up here at the top. In 2014, we were losing 174 Americans to drug overdoses every single day. And that is a terrifying thought. We'll see on the next slide that we are kind of coming down, about a 4% decrease. But that little bit of hope is great for us. That little bit of hope cannot deter us from continuing to fight this opioid epidemic. Despite other things going on in the world, despite the COVID-19 epidemic, the opioid crisis is alive and well, and we can't take our attention off of it. We're losing hundreds of billions of dollars every year in medical costs and other costs associated with fighting this crisis, particularly in getting folks into long-term recovery. That's very expensive. Tons and tons of court costs, and local law enforcement involvement is also included in that cost. And then one thing that I also really took note of here is we're constantly hearing about disparities for women. And quite often we overlook some of the disparities that are happening to our young men. And 20% of the reduction in the male workforce can be attributed directly to opioid misuse and abuse. Typically that is the prescription painkillers as well. And this can happen because, maybe they just got drug tested randomly and they've been fired. Maybe they had involvement with the courts or the police, and they end up getting fired for that. Or maybe they ended up having to go into long-term recovery and they missed, a month of work and they were fired for that. So it can really dramatically impact not just the individual who's losing that job, but our entire community is losing that work productivity as well. And then the states hit hardest. What is going on in West Virginia? 52 per 100,000 overdose rates. And that's non-fatal. So that's including all of the overdoses. It's a lot. And then Ohio and New Hampshire also hit pretty hard. And we know that children involved in the foster care system are at risk for just a plethora of mental health and substance use disorders. And opioids is no different. A lot of the kiddos who are removed from homes, the reason is because of drug possession or drug charges and substance use. And it's just extremely sad that they are at that higher risk. And we need to absolutely take action. But here's kind of the more recent one. So it was 174 in 2014 for all overdose. And now we're looking at about 128 people dying every day from just opioid overdoses. So you see that, a large portion of our daily overdose deaths are attributed to opioids. And that could be prescription forms or illicit forms. They're both included in that number. But, it's just important to note, not only has the year changed, but the statistic is only looking at the opioid overdoses. So it's about a 4% decrease that we've seen. And while that might give a lot of folks hope, it's a little bit of a false hope, because what we're seeing is that it's just shifting categories. We'll come to that in the next slide. But it's kind of misleading, because although these are significantly statistic changes, opioid involved death rates are dropping 2%. Yay. Prescription opioid overdoses are dropping by a huge amount, 13%. Yay, we've made some progress there. And a lot of that can be directly attributed to how we've regulated some of the doctor shopping and pharmacy hopping type of with legislation and bigger registration and systems that can work across from state to state, county to county. And even heroin is down by 4%. But the scary thing is that despite all of these decreases, we're seeing a huge uptick, 10%, in the synthetic opioids. And those can be prescription or illicit. And this synthetic opioid, this group contains the fentanyl, the carfentanil, and the tramadol. Did I say that right, Joe? Tramadol. It includes those ones that have medicinal uses and can be prescribed, but they're also synthetically created in basement labs as well. So it includes the ones made by Big Pharma and the ones that are made in more the black market type of way. But this is the one where we can really see the dramatic changes, and I'll just leave it up a little bit. We're starting all the way back in the 90s, 1999, where we start to see the big wave of overprescribing and unregulated opioid prescriptions, where they're being prescribed for years at a time, not just 6 weeks. Folks are on painkillers for years and years. And then we kind of see that plateau right through here, and then slowly come down by that 4%. It's coming down just a little bit. But at the same time that the prescriptions were starting to get a little bit more regulated, that's when we see heroin start exponentially increasing. And that's why we are attributing a lot of those folks that go from prescription use switch to heroin use when the prescription is no longer available. That's kind of where some of that science is coming from. Because we can see it happening right here in 2010, right around when all of that enforcement and regulation changed. it just starts going up exponentially. And we're starting to get a little bit of a control of that, right? It's dropped, and that's the one that dropped by 2%. But just a few short years after that, we're seeing in 2013, I mean, again, just exponential skyrocketing of the synthetic opioids. And again, that really does include all of those, whether they're manufactured by big pharma and prescribed to you by your doctor, or the more illicit ways of getting a hold of those, and even the ones that you've accidentally gotten a hold of carfentanil. You thought you were just buying heroin, and unfortunately it was laced with fentanyl, and there was an overdose death, a fatal overdose. What's really interesting to me is that this is just the fatal overdoses. I was really having kind of a hard time finding ones that compared the wave for all overdoses. But I'm assuming it's following a pretty similar wave, where we're finally seeing some control of prescriptions, correct some of those issues that we were having, but then we're seeing a rise in the illicit use and in the synthetic versions. What can we do about all this? So it sounds really awful, and I know especially some of you teens, you might be going, how can I affect change on this? It's been going on since the 90s, and we're not getting hold of it. But you absolutely have the power to impact change on this, no matter what age and stage of life you're in. And some of the first steps you can take are just within your very local family, talking to your family and friends about their views of prescription misuse, and educating your friends and family members about what you've learned about it. And of course, if you are unfortunate enough to have an injury or a chronic illness where you need to have a prescription, talk thoroughly with your doctor and your pharmacist about any concerns you have about long-term use. And like Joe said, a lot of the studies are showing right about 6 weeks for really acute injuries, post-surgery complications, and larger accidents that lead to more acute injuries that need an opiate. So just talk with your doctor about all those concerns. Of course, always dispose of medication safely. And we're going to have 2 whole slides on that in just a sec, but getting involved in your community, whether it's actively pursuing changes in legislation or just educating, again, your friends, your family members, your church, your youth group. And we have a very lovely program. We call it T3. It stands for Teens Talking Truth, where you can get involved and do just that. But if you happen to live kind of out of Macomb or Wayne counties, there are also programs available. Sometimes they're through community agencies. Get Googling, find one local to you that has a cause that's really dear to your heart, and take some action. And you can do this, as young as 10, you can get actively involved in your community and make real change. And of course, one of the other things that we can all do is get some form of Narcan or naloxone training. They're free. I don't know anyone who charges for this training. We hold a ton of them through CARE throughout Macomb County. And then Detroit Wayne also does them all the way from like the Points down to downriver. We hold various ones. And if you're interested in those, please just reach out to me and I can send you the most updated ones that I know about. But they're so easy. You don't have to have any medical training to be able to administer Narcan. Call 911 immediately. Roll the person in the recovery position, and then insert this nasal spray into the nasal cavity, push. And quite often, that's enough to save a life, and anyone can do this. You do always still want to make sure that you dial 911 immediately. That should be your first step. Unless the person maybe is vomiting and you've got to get them in the recovery position so they don't choke. Then 911 is step number 2. Always call them, because what I'm hearing from our peer recovery coaches and local law enforcement is that because a lot of these illicit substances are laced with fentanyl and carfentanil, and those are so strong and potent, it might take 2 and 3 doses of Narcan to revive that person. So don't just rely on, hey, I got one in the car, we'll avoid calling anyone. Always still call 911 and get EMS out there, because you might need more than 1 dose. And it's very likely that they're going to need to go to the hospital and kind of initiate getting into more recovery options from there immediately. And like I said, a lot of our local police stations, I think almost all of them really local in the Tri-County area, they have the Hope Not handcuffs. You know, their goal really is to help. Above all, it's protect and serve. And I know in our country, we have deep pockets of injustice there. We cannot deny that. That's a whole nother topic. But in our local Tri-County area, Hope Not handcuffs is alive and well, and they really do want to help you. So absolutely always call 911 first if you are witnessing an overdose. So what are some of the ways that we can really impact this opiate crisis? The first one, of course, is changing legislation. Can we regulate those prescriptions even further? Can we change legislation to include erasing some of folks' misdemeanors and felonies that are keeping them from getting jobs, that might keep them in that cycle of feeling no self-worth, and might keep them addicted to their opiates because they can't get back into society. And that's very depressing, and it's hard to get out of that cycle if you don't have backing by the local community. Patient empowerment is another huge point that we might not all have the ability to impact, but when someone is involved in their recovery options, they're much more likely to have a successful attempt at quitting and having long-term recovery. If they're not involved in the decision-making process around their treatment, then it's very likely that they will relapse and have to have multiple attempts before they can hit the point of long-term recovery. And then again, just that Narcan and naloxone, those trainings are free. After all the trainings that I know of, you can absolutely get the free kit, like keep in your car, keep in your home. And you never know when you might come across someone and be able to help them. Of course, proper medication disposal, which we'll talk about right before we wrap up today. But the stigma reduction can absolutely be impacted by everyone. You know, no matter what your age and stage are, we can all go a long way in reducing the stigma that keeps these people afraid of seeking help and keeps them trapped in cycles where they feel like they're not worth help. So medication disposal is pretty serious. We can absolutely prevent a lot of these overdoses by safely getting these prescriptions out of our medicine cabinet and away from the folks that might be seeking them. So where can we do that? Most local law enforcement police stations have these boxes where you can go deposit them. Pretty much every pharmacy across America has one of these safety boxes as well. Because they want to keep them away from folks that might be trying to break into it and might be seeking these medications. They're usually behind the counter. So you kind of have to go talk to the pharmacist and be like, I'm trying to dispose of this. Where's your safe box? And they'll take it from you and dispose of it for you. And then sometimes I know schools and hospitals do like big drug take back days where they'll bring in a bunch of these bins and you'll be able to come dispose of them. Because of COVID, a lot of those are closed. So the police station or the pharmacy is probably your best bet. But you really want to avoid throwing them away because, again, someone could just pull it out of there. And if they're in withdrawal and drug-seeking behavior, you know, they might pull it out of the trash and take it. And if it does end up making it to the landfill, it can damage the way the landfill is breaking itself down over time. And of course, flushing it, even with our large filtration systems, really potent things like opiates can stay in that water even after filtration because it just gets diluted so far, but it's still contaminated water and can still cause harm. So it is kind of hard to always make sure that we're taking our prescriptions exactly as prescribed. And if we've got leftovers, we get them out of that medicine cabinet right away. But it's important to do. And then that stigma reduction piece is huge. And we can definitely impact this in the way we have everyday conversations, in the way that we talk about people who have a substance use disorder. We really want to avoid calling them addicts, abusers, alcoholics, and avoid calling their test results dirty or clean, because folks internalize being called dirty or clean. And we want to avoid making them feel any worse than they may already feel suffering with this substance use disorder. So, we talked about it, I think, on Marijuana Day. The Diagnosis and Statistical Manual has even been updated. They no longer use this terminology, even at the clinical level. So in our everyday conversations, we absolutely need to switch over to say a person in long-term recovery, a person who is suffering with a substance use disorder, instead of calling them an addict and an abuser, and blaming them for that disorder with our words. So the bottom line is, when you get an opioid prescribed to you, take it only when that pain is needed. Keep it locked up and away from children or anyone in long-term recovery that you might know. Keep it locked up securely. Dispose of it properly, and never share it. Even if someone is very benignly asking, hey, I've got a headache, do you still have some of those left over? Tell them no. Tell them no, we cannot share that. Joe, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Wow, that was very thorough and very educational. Great. No, that was wonderful, Christina.
Thank you so much. What's going on in the chat? I see it lighting up a little bit. Yeah, a lot of the ones that we give out, the naloxone ones, do have 2 doses in them. Thank you, Joe, for adding that. Oh, yes, I feel this is absolutely appropriate for our 6th graders. They can impact change in 6th grade. They can be part of groups like T3, and they can go a long way towards ensuring a brighter future and an end to this long-term opioid epidemic. I think that's the only question I see. Beautiful. So just like with the marijuana slides, you're going to have all of these accesses to treatment. So don't feel like you've got to write down numbers really fast. If you're watching the recording on Schoology, just pause it, take a screenshot, and you can get all these phone numbers for yourself. But if someone is seeking treatment, these are all amazing places to start. Just calling at the county level and finding out, where can I receive care? And I work out of Detroit, Wayne, and we have 37 different mental health providers across the county that help with the full spectrum of prevention, treatment, and of course, supporting long-term recovery. So reach out to us. We can help. Were there any questions anybody wanted to ask verbally?
Christina, how would you be able to tell whether or not there was fentanyl laced in whatever drugs you were using?
You can't. It's completely colorless and odorless. You would not detect that unless you have access to a full lab that can test it. The average person would have no way of knowing. And that's why it can even slip through some of those, like the dealer might not know that their product is tainted, to be able to tell anybody that they're serving it to.
And the purpose of utilizing it is to boost the high?
Yeah, it's to make it stronger, faster acting, more profound, pain relief, and of course, the more profound high as well.
Wow.
Euphoria, I think, is the word they use, right, Joe?
Yeah, and some dealers that have it, they get their the participants kind of hooked on it. It's like, oh, that's really, really good stuff. So yes, they might overdose on it, but they get a whole new clientele from that really good, potent heroin.
And we see it being cut with other things too. You know, every now and then you'll hear it out in the news that there's been a big bust and it was full of like baking powder, or it was full of cleaners. So it really is kind of hard to tell what's in there. So you might be accidentally exposed to a lot of different things. And some of the really big risks come from intravenous users. You know, folks that are through their veins, is we see a lot of needle sharing and needle reusing with folks that end up going that route of administration. And it just puts them at a whole host of risks for different forms of hepatitis, ABC, and then of course HIV and AIDS and all that slippery slope, which is tragic and usually fatal. And then now COVID, right? If you're hanging out with a group of folks that are sharing and exchanging needles, there's a lot of bodily fluid exchange there. It's not just a droplet. You might actually shoot up some of their blood, and anything that they're sick with, you can then get.
Wow. You guys have any other questions you want to ask?
You know, it's definitely one of our heaviest topics. Next week, we kind of come more on the mental health side and less on all of these, you know, really dramatic topics. We're going to be focusing on what I think a lot of us are feeling through COVID, depression and anxiety, and how common that really is in our society and how we can cope and combat that in our daily lives.
All right, then. Thank you again, Christina. We're going to wrap it up, and we will see you all back Tuesday. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great presentation as
Oh,
usual.
thank you, Toni. Definitely tried to cram a little too much trying to finish up